Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenya Lambert. I serve as the Vice President of Development for the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. And I would like to welcome you today to our webinar on the impact of advocacy in a pandemic. Of our board and staff and the communities we work with and for, I would like to just extend our deepest gratitude to each and every one of you for your unwavering support year after year for the organization. And with your continued investment, we're able to continue our crisis advocacy agenda in this moment, right, without interruption. So thank you so much sincerely for fueling this work. And as supporters of the organization, we want to really just share how we're putting your dollars to work. So this is a very important time for the organization to share this information with you as our key supporters. Also, last week, you may have heard a huge announcement for the organization. And last week, we announced that Audra Wilson was named as the new president and CEO of the Shriver Center, and she starts on June 1st. We are so delighted to welcome Audra back to the organization, and we look forward to working with her. For more information on Audra, please visit povertylaw.org/new CEO. So let's begin. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleagues on the front lines advocating for systemic change. First up, we have Kate Walls, our VP of Advocacy and our Senior Director of Litigation for the organization. She will serve as our moderator for today's discussion. You will see me again today to learn how you can take action. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Kate Walls.
Thanks, Kenya. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today with my colleagues about our response to COVID-19 and the crisis advocacy that we are advancing, not just for immediate and emergent change, but for long-term systemic change, long overdue in our communities in Chicago and around the country. Next slide, please. So on today's agenda, we'll be talking about the Shriver Center's work. We'll also be talking about the growing affordable housing crisis, one that we had prior to the pandemic, but only exacerbated now. The challenges with respect to receiving public benefits and unemployment insurance, who's been left out of those expanded benefits and unemployment programs, and what steps we've taken to include people. And finally, talking about a new but critically important area of our work system and how we can ensure that families remain intact, not only now through this pandemic, but for the long term, so that they are set up for success and support. Then we'll open it up to all of you to ask questions of the experts. And then, as Kenya said, we'll move towards take action on behalf of Shriver Center. Next slide, please. So what do we know now in terms of the current landscape? 30 million people at this point have sought unemployment benefits to date around the country. Low-wage workers are both essential and disposable. They are on the front lines of providing our groceries and our food deliveries, their home healthcare aides, but they're also exponentially more likely to be exposed to the virus and to be at risk of homelessness, of not having access to other income and work supports that they need, and not having proper safety measures in place to protect themselves and their loved ones. We also know that 1/3 of Americans did not pay rent in April. And that crisis is only going to continue. Healthcare access also remains a challenge, especially for those without legal status. Finally, the criminal justice system makes it impossible for people to socially distance and to reunite with their loved ones. COVID-19 lays bare long-standing structural racism in this country and in Illinois. What we also know is that undocumented communities have largely been left out of the recovery. They are not eligible for unemployment Mixed status and undocumented families are not eligible for the federal stimulus checks, and they are still under threat of the public charge rule, which we continue to challenge in court, along with 6 other litigants that have filed cases around the country. Next slide, please. So what has the Shriver Center done since the start of this pandemic? We have worked with our community partners to identify what low-income and communities of color may need to be economically secure, healthy, housed, and free from discrimination. We have advocated at all levels, local, state, and federal, for immediate and long-term reform. This is really why policy advocacy is so critical, even in the best of times, but especially now, where we need systems reform, where we need legislation and administrative efforts to look to the long term in improving the economic outlook and security of all communities, in particular Black and Brown communities. So what have we done in response? My colleagues are going to drill down in some specific areas, but I'm going to highlight some of the other parts of our work that hasn't been touched on today. First, we've done everything we can to ensure expanded Medicaid coverage. So we've had Medicaid coverage in place now in Illinois for COVID-19 testing and treatment, and we've gotten providers free to take the uninsured whether or not they have Medicaid coverage. We've also ensured that there's a suspension of Medicaid termination and eased up a redetermination requirement. We've seen a 5,000% increase on our website Help Hub, which helps people gain access to public benefits, including Medicaid and SNAP, and provides information to providers, ensuring that people can gain access. So that's just a few of the things that we've done, but we're going to turn it over next now to my colleague and housing staff attorney, Emily Coffey, to talk about what work we've done in terms of housing.
Thank you, Kate. Once again, my name is Emily Coffey. I am a housing justice staff attorney at the Shriver Center, where I advocate with and for people who are the most impacted by injustice in the housing system. We know that systemic racism in the policies and laws that drive and community investment result in skyrocketing rents, substandard living conditions, and continued segregation of Black and Brown communities, and that these issues are all the more severe during the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has really shown us how essential it is to be able to shelter in place, and has really exposed the severity of the problem of housing instability. Before the pandemic, over half of Illinois low-income renters were already rent burdened, and Illinois had one of the highest rates of underwater mortgages in the country. Today, about a third of households nationally fear that they cannot make their next rent, mortgage, or utility payment. Black and Brown communities disproportionately experience these housing instabilities, and we know that 1 out of 5 Black households nationally have a net worth of 0 or less. During this public health emergency, it is essential that people are not displaced and everyone has access to stable housing. We know that congregate settings, that is jails, prisons, detention centers, homeless shelters, and nursing homes, house our most vulnerable residents and make it impossible to socially distance. So they are the absolute worst place to be during a pandemic. During this public health emergency and afterwards, we have to make sure that everyone has a safe place to call home. The pandemic has really been a wake-up call for many, realizing for the first time just how significant the housing barriers are who've had contact with the criminal legal system. Unfortunately, we know that housing discrimination is the norm for returning citizens and individuals who have had contact with the criminal legal system. We need to address housing access and affordability now, because it is critical to protecting the public health and addressing systemic racism. Next slide, please. In Illinois, there is currently a moratorium on the filing of most eviction cases. The moratorium is a critical component to tackling the immediate crisis, but if these moratoriums end without comprehensive relief, we know that evictions and foreclosures will rise exponentially. Communities will suffer and the public health crisis will be exacerbated if tenants and homeowners face immediate demand for an entire backlog of rent and mortgage payments when the moratorium expires and the courts will be overrun with eviction and foreclosure filings, and a chaotic displacement process will ensue. We need comprehensive relief, including significant rental assistance funding, assist renters who cannot pay their rent, and foreclosure forbearance to ensure homeowners do not lose their home. We know that involuntary displacement is terrible for communities. An eviction interrupts a child's education, causing the child to have lower school achievement and delayed literacy skills, and to be more likely to be truant. It can threaten the child's social and emotional security, and adversely impacts families in the form of stress and exposure to substandard housing with environmental hazards. Next slide, please. We also know that the intersection of the criminal legal system and the housing system have created the perfect storm for racial inequity. Black and brown communities experience disproportionate rates of incarceration and contact with the criminal legal system. Black people make up just 15% of our population, but represent 56% of those who are incarcerated. These disparities are compounded by rampant housing discrimination against justice-involved individuals, which prevents them from returning home, from shelter with their families. Next slide, please. The Shriver Center has been working on a variety of initiatives to ensure people can remain in their homes and their community, and to ensure that the justice-involved individuals have access to safe and stable housing. First, we are working with Representative Delia Ramirez and Senator Peters on the COVID-19 Emergency and Economic Recovery Renter and Homeowner Protection Act, that is House Bill 5570, Amendment 1. In short, the bill would extend the eviction and foreclosure moratorium, set up a residential relief fund to compensate landlords and banks for missed rent and mortgage payments, ensure that all homeowners can receive an affordable forbearance option on their mortgage, provide additional safeguards in the eviction and foreclosure process, and to amend the Illinois Human Rights Act to ensure that essential workers and returning citizens are protected from housing discrimination. We sent an alert on our website and on Twitter, if you follow us, to give you some action steps that you can take to support this critically important bill this week. Additionally, the Just Housing Initiative, which the Shriver Center is an active participant in, has come together with community justice advocates, including our own community justice team, to push for broad solutions to help persons who are released from prison or jails secure housing. With the Illinois Housing Development Authority and several foundations, we are proposing a pilot that would create temporary and long-term housing solutions for individuals without a reliable host site upon reentry. At the same time, we are advocating for public housing authorities to be partners in this effort. Under a new waiver from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, housing authorities can immediately change their screening policies and relax their guest policies to ensure that individual ones who are residing in subsidized housing can welcome the returning citizens back into their homes. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, I am happy to answer them now.
Actually, we're going to hold the questions, except I have one question for you, Emily, before I let you go. If House Bill 5574, House Amendment 1, does not pass and the moratorium on evictions ends in Illinois, what is your prediction of what's going to happen to renters?
Yeah, I think we're going to see something that's even worse than what we saw in the Great Recession. Eviction court in normal times, in pre-pandemic times, is already overloaded and not a place where renters could really achieve justice. And with the moratorium, the number of cases that will be filed all at once will just go up exponentially. Foreclosures are also on hold, but if courts reopen before there are programs set up to assist and homeowners who have received forbearance options that include balloon payments that homeowners cannot afford to pay at the end of that payment period, it will mean that the courts are overloaded. It will mean that homeowners and renters are displaced from their homes and from their communities. And we'll see Generally speaking, an increase in foreclosures of longtime owners and small landlords who are essential for a thriving community. They will lose their homes to speculators, hastening gentrification and displacement. We learned a lot of lessons from the Great Recession, and we should act on them now. That's what the COVID-19 Emergency and Economic Recovery Renter and Homeowner Protection Act seeks to do. And so it's really critical that we work to get that bill passed.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and thank you for your partnership. If you have questions for Emily or for our two next speakers, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll be looking through those and then presentation. Next, we're going to turn to Jeremy Rosen. Jeremy is the Director of Economic Justice at the Shriver Center. Prior to coming to the Shriver Center, Jeremy and I were lucky to work together when he was the policy director at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty in Washington, D.C. Jeremy's going to talk to us today about public benefits and unemployment insurance and some of the challenges and opportunities that have been presented during this pandemic.
Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone this afternoon. So the Economic Justice team at the Shriver Center protects access to income and protects the employment rights of the lowest income people in our state and across the country, including in particular our immigrant communities. So first, I'm gonna start off by talking about what I think is a constant theme of this presentation. Not good before COVID-19. We were dealing with a system of outdated offices with long lines, terrible technology. Anybody who's been reading any of the stories about the challenges people have faced in getting unemployment have seen that our state unemployment system was running on 1980s computers. Our system for receiving applications for food assistance, SNAP benefits, sometimes relies on people faxing in applications. Our systems have not adapted to new technology. There's a sort of a technology gap that many of our clients face, where they often don't have access to things like computers or internet access. But as a colleague always reminds me, there is one computer that almost every one of our clients has. It's called a cell phone, but our systems for applying for and managing benefits and public benefits programs really don't work well with cell phones. So we haven't adapted to modern technology. And all of these challenges have resulted in a disproportionate impact on people of color and have been fundamentally accepted by most people who aren't impacted. If you think about it, you know, when was the last time that any of us went down to a public assistance office and sort of looked at the conditions that folks face in trying to apply for and maintain their benefits? I think if we all did that when those offices were open, those would not be the kinds of offices and facilities that we'd be comfortable with for our government systems. Next slide, please. Let's talk about what's happened over the last few months, and it's been amazingly dramatic. I think this impact has been clearly even worse than what we faced in the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. SNAP applications up by 400%. They've since come down a little bit, but are still running well above normal. Unemployment claims jumped by a factor of 12 between last spring and this spring. Folks who lost their jobs because of our current system of healthcare, which relies so much on healthcare provided by employers. Many people not only lost their source of income through their jobs, but they lost their healthcare as well. So they were dealing with both of those challenges at once. or they've been forced perhaps to pay for that health care through COBRA, continuing coverage, which is extremely expensive. And for almost all public benefits, including in most cases unemployment, in many cases SNAP, except for citizen children, and certainly around the stimulus checks that many of us received, where we had 500,000 immigrants in our state ineligible to receive those funds. The Shriver Center really recognized and has focused its advocacy on making sure that that have been left out of a lot of the federal recovery efforts could be assisted here at the state level. Next slide, please. And so what were we facing in trying to get that done? All offices of the Illinois Department of Human Services where people go to apply for SNAP, Medicaid, and TANF were closed. Caseworkers were frantically trying to do their work and connect to their computer systems at home with laptops. We had the state's unemployment offices, of course, also closed. The phone lines and websites were inaccessible because they were overwhelmed. And we had serious language access barriers. So the website, just for example, required people to click through 2 screens of complicated information in English before you got to a 3rd screen where you could pick an option to apply for unemployment benefits in Spanish. But if you were just a Spanish speaker, it was very unlikely in most cases you could even figure out how to click through those 2 initial screens before you finally got to the application in Spanish. And then what we saw both in applications for SNAP and for unemployment is that these issues really hit home for a very large population of people who were not used to applying for, needing to rely on public assistance. So you had additional challenges with people just knowing where to turn for help and not being accustomed to some of the dysfunction in these systems that they just hadn't seen in the past. Next slide. So what have we done? Well, we decided that, of course, in a time of crisis, we had to figure out how to get more money to people who need it. And so with many of our partners, both at the state and often the federal level, we've advocated to do just that. So at the federal level, the federal government has provided significant extra food assistance, SNAP benefits for families. They decided that every family would receive the maximum benefits available for a household of that particular size. So if you had a household of 3 people, that could receive a maximum of approximately $400 a month in SNAP benefits, but had some income and so was only receiving $200, that family would be topped up to receive the full amount of $400. The federal government also provided significant additional resources for unemployment benefits, ensuring that above the weekly benefit that folks qualified for based on their income, they would get an extra $600 a week. Our state adopted presumptive eligibility policies for Medicaid that allowed the state to enroll people first and get them covered, and then work to answer a lot of the questions around their eligibility just to make sure people were being covered as quickly as possible. Things we're doing now that are hopefully going to be part of the state budget that is being worked on this week is really pushing to get state-funded cash payments for immigrants out of federal relief, and something that's extremely important for all the work we're doing, all the things we're going to talk about today. Our state budget is facing a serious deficit for the next fiscal year, and lawmakers are about to go to Springfield this week to grapple with that. We really need significant fiscal relief from the federal government to ensure that our state budget is able to be as strong as possible and we don't suffer cuts to vital programs and services that our clients need the most. We have also worked really hard with our state agency, and they've been wonderful, the Department of Human Services, to ensure that we get lots of waivers from the federal government, and that has allowed us to speed up the application process for benefits and to really make sure that the doing fewer eligibility reviews so people would be able to continue receiving benefits and agency staff could focus on getting new people enrolled. At the Shriver Center directly, as Kate mentioned, our Help Hub site has been barraged with inquiries for help and how to get people enrolled in benefits. We've put up a resource page. We've done a number of webinars, including a number on benefits for immigrants, one of which I think had 500 folks attending it, which is about as big a webinar as I'm aware of us having at any time. Next slide, please. So we're also thinking about the long term because we realize that we've got to think through the immediate crisis and get people today, but we've got to change our systems so that they work better in the long term for everybody, because even 1, 2, 3 years from now, we don't want these systems to go back to the dysfunctional state that they were in before. We want them working well and benefiting everybody in our state and around the country. So 3 things that are critical for us: supporting the fair tax, making sure that everybody votes for that on the ballot in November. The fair tax would make our tax system much more equitable in Illinois and would also raise about $3 billion a year in really important revenue that our state's going to need to provide the programs and services that our clients depend on. As we go forward in the future, we want to reimagine our public benefit system. We want to make sure that everybody's got access to health care, immigrant communities. We want to make sure that technology works well and people are able to access the programs that they need. We want to make sure that we're looking at basic income and cash payments for people rather than a fragmented public benefit system. And we want to make sure that all of these program flexibilities that we have gotten our state agencies to agree during the pandemic, and which are working really well to help make sure our clients can access benefits, are continued, because there's just no reason to stop doing those things and return to other systems that were not working. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. We appreciate you and your team's efforts. I just have one question before we turn to Tanya. And again, just to remind everyone to use the chat pod if you have questions during the presentation. We've heard that many of the Secretary of State offices are closed. And so at this point, you cannot get or renew a driver's license or state ID. What unique challenges does that present for individuals who need or are applying for public benefits?
Yeah, that's been really challenging. So, you know, the Illinois Department of Human Services has been a wonderful partner in terms of helping people apply for benefits, but connected. And so within the state, it's been a real challenge to have the Secretary of State's office not go to sort of remote work, but really just almost completely shut down and very much limited services. So if somebody had access to a computer and already had an ID, was already in the system, they could maybe renew that ID. But for anybody who needed a new ID, it's been impossible to get during this time. And as you try to apply for public benefits, of course, one of the critical things folks have to do is be able to verify their identity. And so the easiest way to do that is just to be able to type in a driver's license or state ID number. And that, of course, interfaces with state systems and allows people to verify ID. But when people don't have that, when somebody's homeless and might have lost their ID or never begin with, this is the case for some seniors who just don't have IDs anymore. That's been a challenge. Ultimately, people will still get benefits and assistance because folks like the Department of Human Services have created workarounds to get around the fact that people don't have ID, but the lack of ID causes significant delays and might mean that people, instead of getting needed food assistance in a week, are getting it in a month. And obviously, you have to ask, what are they doing and how are they surviving during that time? So it's been a real problem.
Well, the fight continues. Thank you, Jeremy. Next up is Tanya Gassenheimer. Sorry, Tanya. Tanya is a staff attorney with our community justice team and has started a new advocacy of our work, looking at the child welfare system and the racial impact of that and its interrelationship to the juvenile justice system and the criminal legal system. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us. Next slide, please. So this is a new area of work for us here at Shriver, about a year in now. So just to set some federal level context, there is a federal statutory framework that governs child welfare proceedings and cases that are of particular in light of this pandemic. So there's a federal law called the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And on your screen, you'll see one of the portions of that, which requires that in the case of a child who's been in foster care, so that means any foster placement, whether the placements have changed, if for 15 of the most 22 recent months, the state shall, and shall is a pivotal word in this law, shall file a petition to terminate the parental rights of the child's parents. So what does that mean in a pandemic? It for parents who are involved in the child welfare system and seeking reunification with their children, there is this mandate in federal law that requires this filing of termination of parental rights. And while this clock is ticking in a pandemic, programs are closed, facilities are inaccessible, visits are not being held, so parents are unable to comply with all the requirements of their cases, are unable to see their children, visit with their children, all while this clock is ticking on them, and they have no ability to fight that. So that is an important thing to remember as we talk more about Illinois specifically and some local advocacy, that there is this overlay of federal limitations and issues that states and jurisdictions are grappling with how in this crisis. And then another aspect of the federal context is, in light of these issues, the Children's Bureau, which is the federal administrative agency in the Department of Health and Human Services, that governs child welfare, they issued a letter at the end of March advising around child welfare cases in this crisis. They advised what judicial determinations, what court hearings must continue. They advised against sweeping blanket orders, ceasing, suspending, or postponing court. They family time and specifically discouraged blanket court orders reducing or suspending family time. They were talking about the importance of family time, the trauma of family separation, and how, especially in times of crisis like these that we're in, it's important to remain steadfast in our commitment to family reunification, family preservation. They also touched on services and program closures that the courts and child aware and up to date and documenting what the changes are, what the issues are, and what parents can and cannot access. Next slide, please. So what the local context has been here in Illinois, as all of you I'm sure are aware, Governor Pritzker has his stay-at-home order, which exempts essential activities from the stay-at-home requirement. So what is an essential activity? According to Governor Pritzker's order, those include accessing healthcare. They include caring for others, including caring for family members. Services, and it's important to note that Governor Pritzker specifically named DCFS, the Department of Children and Family Services, as a human service exempt from the stay-at-home order. So that applies both to DCFS staff and the programmatic side, that workers are allowed to continue conducting their critical work, and for families that they are allowed to continue accessing these critical services. There's also an exemption for essential government, which is where it specifies child welfare and child protection personnel, and then essential travel, which is travel to and from any of these activities. And then on the judicial side of things, Judge Evans has an administrative order that closed the courts and then specified by division what that meant. So for child welfare cases, what was supposed to proceed were two things. One, temporary custody here, the initial removal hearings when a child is removed from the custody of that child's parents, and then any emergency matters, any emergency motions. Next slide, please. And so what is happening in practice? In practice, in the courts, the temporary custody, the removal hearings are continuing, but nothing else, because the courts are not even entertaining any other issues as sufficiently emergent. So what that means for parents is that as their attorneys are fighting for their access to for any other issues that arise in their cases, the courts, let alone ruling on those motions or making those decisions, they're not even entertaining the motions. They're not even setting those hearings, which is really reflective of the value our system places on parents, on visits, parent-child visits, that those aren't deemed emergencies says it all. Also, programs are closed, understandably so, but for parents who need to access those services, the closures are not being documented by child welfare personnel in the service plans, which is where there is a list of what parents have to do towards reunification. So it is understandable that these programs are closed or not accessible for the time being, but what is critical changes be reflected and documented, because otherwise what we are afraid of and expect to happen is that when courts do reopen, it's going to come down to the system's word against individual parents' words, which is an issue that is pervasive, pandemic or not. And then visits has become an issue of growing urgency. DCFS issued a policy at the end of March suspending across the board all in-person supervised. And despite the federal guidance we talked about advising specifically against blanket policies and orders like this, DCFS did so anyway. And they suggested and urged the transition to virtual visits, but what we're hearing from advocates on the ground is those are happening sporadically at best, and more often than not are not happening at all. DCFS is not providing parents with the technology. A lot of parents either don't have the technology or can't access it, and DCFS is not offering alternative solutions to how children can remain in contact with their children. And what that has meant is many children are devastatingly cut off from their children entirely. So no contact whatsoever. They don't know if their children have been exposed to COVID-19, if their children have contracted the virus. They don't know how their children are handling this crisis emotionally. And it's really horrible what's happening. Next slide, please. So as I started to touch on with visits and beyond, this, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, this system, as with many others, has a disproportionate impact on families who are overrepresented in the foster system, particularly in Chicago and throughout the state of Illinois. And as we know from the news and studies, that the pandemic is taking a disproportionate toll on Black and Brown communities, just by contraction of the virus, healthcare access. This is now, the child welfare system is adding another layer of that disproportionality. So now the parents who were already at highest risk of many of the issues related to this pandemic now have this additional burden, and a particularly traumatic one, since it interferes with the ever important parent-child dynamic and relationship. It is traumatic on both sides, both for parents and for the children. There is research about the trauma of family separation on children, and for younger children in particular who for virtual visits, for example, may not be able to engage or even understand what's happening over a screen. They may not understand that their parent is there or that this is meant to be a visit. Parents, as I mentioned, are penalized in their legal cases, because if these changes, if these issues are not accurately and diligently recorded and documented, they have no recourse to claim and fight and prove that it was because of the pandemic that they weren't able to comply with X, Y, or Z requirement. And then with the overlay of date, with that clock continuing to tick, that's adding an additional barrier to reunification. And with additional difficulty to reunifying, and then for some of these parents, this meaning a potential petition to terminate their parental rights, this pandemic and the system's responses thereto are having and will continue to have permanent and lifelong consequences. Next slide, please. So how has Shriver, how have advocates responded? Locally, we started by attempting to engage with DCFS directly. We sent a letter with a coalition of partners to DCFS on March 20th. The Public Defender's Office sent a letter specific to the issue of visits in the middle of April, and DCFS did not respond until 28th, so over a month from our initial letter, and their response did not address any of our individual recommendations. We made recommendations that spanned the life of a child protection, child welfare case. We made recommendations to prevent entry into the system. We made recommendations about visits, about facilitating reunification, and none of those recommendations was specifically addressed. We had advocates and partners in Texas, even a jurisdiction in Canada, who followed suit and sent similar letters to their child welfare agencies. So our recommendations can easily be adapted, since a lot of these issues are being faced in jurisdictions across the country and beyond. With the lack of engagement from DCFS, we kind of went into a second phase of advocacy to try to get creative for continued for solutions. And so I would say we're still in that. Part of that push is with the media, shifting the narrative. One of the reasons Shriver is engaged in child welfare work now is because of the lack of, or not the lack of, the problematic narrative surrounding child welfare. There are significant parallels between the criminal legal system and the child welfare system. They operate in their disproportionate impacts on Black and Brown communities, on a lot of how they function, and yet in the public consciousness and awareness, we don't feel that folks realize that fully yet, and that's part of what we are trying to expose. So we want to expose those parallels, that the child welfare system is also another punitive system that has a lot of similar issues as with what my colleagues have mentioned in housing, in criminal system. We are trying to engage in political advocacy. So DCFS does fall under the purview of the governor. And so what pressure can we build there if we can get political entities, politicians themselves talking about these issues, engaged with these issues, and we enlist their support in continuing to try to push DCFS. And then the Public Defender's Office filed a lawsuit around the issue of visits on May 6th and challenging DCFS's policy, the blanket ban. That decision came down today, and the courts unfortunately dismissed that case. And so again, we are faced with a challenge, a barrier, and have to reconvene and reassess and continue to push and figure out where to go next with this advocacy. And then there's also the federal level advocacy, which Shriver is a part of as well, talking through how we can make changes to that federal statutory framework in a way that would decrease the penalties on parents. And I think a key piece that, and throughout all of this, is one of our goals is exposing and shifting the narratives, exposing that the issues in the child welfare system that, as my colleagues have said, are issues that, like with other systems, are not unique to COVID-19. They are exacerbated and perhaps urgent because of this pandemic, but these are issues that occur all throughout the year. And so trying to expose those issues and sustain the momentum that we're starting to build throughout this pandemic and beyond. So a lot of this advocacy can be specific and responsive to this pandemic, but it also is advocacy that we are hoping to sustain well beyond this pandemic to make broader systems change. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for sharing your advocacy and clearly your passion. Given the decision from this morning in the public defender's case that was trying to ensure that parents did have visitations with their children, what do you see as the next steps in this advocacy agenda?
So I think we still are working to figure out what that looks like, but I think it is continuing to see where our pressure points are. Just because we got an adverse decision doesn't mean the advocacy stops. I'm sure that the public defenders are strategizing about what that looks like in the context of that specific litigation. And then in our position, both supporting their case, our position as the Shriver Center in the policy arena, what can we do? And I think that does involve continuing to talk to media, talk to political allies, build that pressure so that we continue to engage more folks, so more eyes are on this. Because the more folks are watching what's happening, seeing what's going on and starting to understand these issues, we can kind of push forward with that. One element of actually the public defender's case was their hearing that was last week. We initiated and engaged with our partners to push out an action alert through social media. And so the case, the court was streaming it on Zoom. They had to move it from Zoom to YouTube because of how many requests they got. And then on YouTube, the last I saw, there were close to 1,400 views, and there were close to 400 people viewing it live while I was watching it. So, and those were advocates that I know of personally from not just Illinois, but across the country. So just that momentum of people are watching and people are thinking about these issues and strategizing all across the country of how to move forward. I think that is going to be key in our next steps.
And I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And just again, a reminder to everyone who's listening in, feel free to put your question in the chat pod, and then I'll make sure that your question is answered. You talked a little bit about, or a lot about actually, narrative shift. And I think what we have often heard about the child welfare system, particularly in Chicago, is sort of some of the worst stories imaginable of horrible cruelty to children and abuse. Can you put that in perspective in terms of the real numbers of what these cases are looking like, abuse cases versus neglect cases, and their relationship to poverty?
Sure. So I can't quote specific numbers, but there is an overwhelming majority of cases that are due to neglect, which is a very amorphous categorization. If you look at DCFS's website, they have their information broken down by allegation, and there are tens of different allegations under neglect. So it can be something like inadequate supervision, which I believe is their number 74. And inadequate supervision is where you get allegations of neglect because a mother left her child unattended in her room for 5 to 7 minutes. That was in a case of mine. My client had left her daughter sleeping in her room, and it was in the records that it was 5 to 7 minutes while she was escorting someone out of the building. And making that even more egregious was that she was a youth in DCFS care. She was in a building full of DCFS staff. And so she knew that her baby was safe in that room. And for perspective too, these often tend to be symptoms of poverty. Neglect often is nothing more than a symptom of poverty. Inadequate access to food, inadequate access to shelter. These are all allegations of neglect, and they're nothing more than someone experiencing poverty. And for leaving a child unattended, if you have a large house, even you can be in a separate room from your child for 5 to 7 minutes, and the system would never have eyes on that and would never be concerned that that was neglect. And so part of the narrative shift that needs to happen is, how do we shift from penalizing poverty to supporting people who are experiencing poverty? Why don't we support them through those symptoms of poverty instead of penalizing them and just pushing them deeper and deeper into these systems?
Permanently fracturing their families. Thank you, Tanya. All right, I'm gonna look at our questions. Keep sending them as you think about what more information you need for us or ideas that you may have about our advocacy for work. First, a great question from Karen: is your work only in Illinois? No, we are a national multi-state organization. The Shriver Center leads the Legal Impact Network. And the Legal Impact Network is made up of 35 states and the District of Columbia of law and organizations that look like us, that do impact litigation and policy advocacy to push out best practices and to advance racial justice. So we do a lot of work here in Illinois with our Illinois-based team that we push out to the Legal Impact Network. At the same time, we take those great ideas that those fellow advocates have in states around the country and bring them back to Illinois. It is in many respects our response to ALEC, if you're familiar with that organization, that is pushing out a very conservative agenda of policy advocacy state by state to really make the states not work for people living in poverty and not to advance racial justice for Black and Brown communities. We are the direct response to that. So that's why a lot of our work is grounded in Illinois, but shared around the country. I have a question from Susan, another great question. Is there any data to show how Blacks living in concentrated poverty neighborhoods suffer even more than other poverty neighborhoods during this pandemic? Panelists, would anyone like to share their information about this question from Susan? I think there is some data. I'll just start. First, we know even prior to the pandemic that living in a concentrated, racially concentrated area of poverty literally deprives you of opportunity and changes your life trajectory. There's a great book called The Geography of Opportunity that explores this. But there's been some good data analysis over the last 8 weeks by zip code at what is happening and finding that in Black and Brown poor communities, they are suffering disproportionate rates of exposure to COVID-19 and exposure to the most lethal form of COVID-19. You also look back at other natural disasters in our country, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and sort of the same story is being told. The United States, America, is already not working for Black and Brown communities, even in the best of times, that when there is a disaster, whatever fragile framework they have for survival is toppled. So this is why we need long-term reform in Illinois and around the country. We have a question from Joe Moore. Which legislatures are our allies? And what do you suggest supporters of Shriver do to push Shriver's agenda on these areas you have highlighted today? Tanya, Emily, thoughts on that?
So I would say in terms of the bill that that I mentioned for the Emergency Homeowner and Renter Protection Act, now is the time to be reaching out to every legislator at the state level to get their attention on these issues. We do have a number of allies that have been making sure that that housing is something that is going to be prioritized in the omnibus bill that we're expecting out of the state legislature over the our sponsor is Representative Delia Ramirez and Senator Peters, and we have many other allies that are co-sponsors of this effort. Currently, the bill is in the executive committee, so any member of the executive committee in the House is who we should be immediately reaching out to get their support for this effort.
And in the public benefits world, we're really focused on things that can happen in the Illinois budget this year, which again is one of those few things that they're going to be doing in this very limited legislative session that we have this week. So the ability to reach out to anybody who is on the appropriations committee and is one of the senior members of those committees who sort of go behind closed doors and craft the final budget, working collaboratively with folks in the governor's office, is going to be absolutely the most vital thing that people can do within the next 48 hours.
Yes,
and
so
then,
go ahead, Tanya.
For the child welfare work, Representative Ammons has been a strong ally, understanding the issues and the need for this work. She's been great. I also think that part of the need for narrative shifting is getting that awareness, that consciousness out there into the public. So paying attention to media stories when they happen, or even issues that are happening in your local jurisdictions, and having these conversations, engaging to expose some of these issues, and look further into it, because I think a goal of some of the child welfare work and advocacy is to get where the criminal legal conversation is and where that work is, and that of course needs to continue as well. But being at the point of trying to expose some of these issues, a lot of it is having the conversations, knowing who the allies are, and just doing that work as well.
Yeah, so we are in very unique times in Illinois. We're compressing our state legislative session into 3 days. So even for our seasoned advocates at the Shriver Center, it will be challenging to have contact with our, and so talking to the appropriators, encouraging the governor's office to continue to lead in these areas, and the executive committee may be a place to go. Also stay tuned for seeing notices of our updated action alerts. I have a question from Rodney. Are there sort of particular challenges with respect to urban areas in Illinois? We've talked about some of those sort of unique issues coming up in Chicago. In urban areas, are there particular challenges there? I guess, Emily, starting with you, is there an issue just with the sort of absolute lack of affordable housing in more rural areas of the state?
Absolutely. We see, kind of similar issues in downstate and in more rural areas, but the challenges and pathways for addressing them look pretty different depending on whether you're in an urban area, suburban area, rural area. One of the biggest challenges would be healthcare. An adequate supply of affordable housing that is not only affordable but is also healthy and safe. We see a lot in downstate Illinois with public housing that is seriously deteriorating and harming people's health because there's not been adequate investment into the housing in those communities. And so it's really critical that we are approaching these issues comprehensively and looking how things differ in urban and.
And for the child welfare context, there of course are the particular issues of urban areas like Chicago, but there are, as Emily said, it may look different, and advocacy and response may look different, but there very much are these issues around the state. One issue is for parents who are seeking reunification with their children, they may be required to attend certain services. And if you're in particularly rural areas around the state, there may be one service provider for miles and miles, if that. And then it's a matter of how does a parent even access? If there is a mental health provider or a treatment center 20 miles away, and this is someone who's experiencing poverty, who may not have access to transportation, what does that mean for that parent's fight and that parent's case? So yes, I think there are issues specific to rural areas, and it's something that we continue to try to engage with and understand, knowing that we are in Chicago. I am on a listserv of attorneys and advocates who work with parents around the state of Illinois. So we try to check in with some of those advocates to understand what some of these issues look like in different parts of the state.
And I would really say, unfortunately, poverty is something that we see everywhere in our state. So there's certainly significant urban poverty in areas of Chicago and in other parts of the metro area. We have this dramatic statistic that folks living in Streeterville, I think, have a life expectancy of 90, whereas folks living just a few miles away have a life expectancy of roughly 60, which is truly appalling. But at the same time, among immigrant communities and among a lot of folks who have moved out of the city, we see significant poverty in the suburbs around Chicago and other metro areas. And similarly to Tanya's point, if you look at more rural areas of the state, you may have one office of the Department of Human Services when those offices are open that applications for SNAP or Medicaid or cash assistance that covers an area of 6 or 7 or 8 rural counties. So it's a significant challenge for people to access those offices and the services they provide, even though there is a lot of need.
And I think what we forget sometimes is that we had an economic crisis in Illinois before this, when we had a budget impasse, and so many of the critical nonprofit social service providers in downstate Illinois and rural communities closed during that budget impasse, and there's nothing that's came up to support them. So they're really also dealing with just a total lack of access to begin with this pandemic and new economic crisis. So we're going to take one final question, but feel free to reach out to any one of us after this event. We've really enjoyed taking time with you today to talk about our work in advocacy, and we appreciate your continued partnership. So Diana asks, how can we make a stronger impact on a federal level to ensure that more of the stimulus funds filter down to populations living in poverty? So we saw what the House did, so anyone would like to predict what may happen in the Senate and what we can do, because it is critical. We've got to get those federal dollars, not just to Illinois, but to every state around the country in order to advance long-term reform.
This is Jeremy. I don't know that I want to predict what the Senate will do, but that signs are not encouraging in terms of what the leadership of the Senate is suggesting. They're talking about taking a month or more before taking any further action, and then sort of rejecting the House bill completely, which is really, really troublesome, because for anything from state fiscal relief, which is critical to make sure we balance the budget, to more housing money, to more healthcare money to support Medicaid, to more money to support our public benefit programs, to providing cash assistance for immigrant tax-paying households, which was not done in the first round of stimulus checks, but is something that the House bill proposes to both rectify for the second round and go back and fix for the first round retroactively. These are critical things that we need economic recovery for the lowest income people in our state. And so we know that a lot of people are talking to Senators Durbin and Duckworth, and they are really stalwart supporters of our work, but we've got to get them, and I would say especially Senator Durbin, just because of his position in Senate leadership, to really, really push hard for the priorities that impact the lowest income people. And so for his office to hear that folks from Illinois want that to happen is going to be invaluable.
And I will say for the child welfare space, just a general stay tuned, because we are working at the federal level on some advocacy. And of course, as soon as we're able to make some headway or see where that might go, we will let you all know, and ways that you can support. Of course, it's, we alluded to, it's unpredictable. It's hard to say what will happen, but if the stars align in a way that we can push for some progress in the child welfare space, we're actively trying to do that.
Emily, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would really echo everything that Jeremy just said, and to make sure that our congressional representatives really are emphasizing these issues, that they know that their constituents care about them, and that it is essential that as much financial resources as possible come to the state so that we can tackle these issues that are so critical.
Well, thank you again to my colleagues and panelists, not only for all the immense amount of work that they have done since the start of this pandemic. Should know they have worked nonstop to get systems turned on to work on behalf of people living in poverty and to ensure that there is racial justice in spite of this crisis and for the long term. So I really want to thank them and all of their colleagues for putting in the effort during this time. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kenya to close us out. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. And once again, many thanks to you and your leadership for leading our attorneys this work towards poverty alleviation and systems change. And so the work needs to continue without interruption. And many thanks to our key supporters on this webinar for your continued support year after year. Once again, there are ways that you can continue to fuel this fight. We are unapologetic about asking for financial resources to continue policy advocacy. As you can see, we are in the middle of shaping policy that not only will have an impact for today, but also for generations to come. So thank you for your continued support. And also, if you would like to renew your support, we invite you to go to povertylaw.org/donate. Also, as mentioned, my colleagues discussed that Springfield is in session this week. And so we have made available our COVID-19 policy agenda on our visit povertylaw.org/COVID agenda. There you will find the bills that my colleagues mentioned today. We're asking that you talk to your legislators about these bills that we want to advance in this moment in time. And so we need your support. We're asking that you call, you email, or even send a message to them on social media, right? That gets a lot of attention. So we're asking you to leverage your influence today. Also, we will invite you to share our work on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I'm sure I'm forgetting another one, but we're on those social media platforms. And so we're asking you to share our work. And then lastly, we have a post-webinar survey. It's about 2 questions. We would love to hear from you, your experience, and this will just help us moving forward for you in the future. Once again, thank you for our panelists, our moderator, to all of our attorneys working at the Shriver Center, to all of our key supporters for your ongoing support. Thank you, and we look forward to staying in touch. Take care. Bye-bye.